A slum set alight in the Philippine capital, Manila. A war is raging between rich and poor. At stake, control of the country's resources. The battle lines have been drawn and the military are taking sides. Now, hundreds of civilians are being killed and abducted, and the relatives of the missing are crying out for help.
They say there's been 910 extrajudicial killings, there's 225 political prisoners, and there's 193 disappearances.
Our journey begins in the remote northern highlands of the Philippines. We're here to meet Marxist rebels who've waged a 40-year civil war for a communist state.
We've been travelling most of the night along these mountainous roads to get to a town to meet a contact who we're told will take us in to see the armed communist rebels. We're not quite sure what that's going to entail yet, but we're told there will be a trek involved.
The rebels are suspicious of any outside contact, and it's taken weeks of negotiation for us to be allowed in. We're taken along a concealed path to avoid being seen by the government army.
Good morning. How are you?
Suddenly armed men emerge from the jungle. These were the rebels we'd come to meet, fighters of the New People's Army, deemed terrorists by the Filipino government.
So this is Simon, who's the NPA leader of this area, one of the most notorious and actually one of the government's most wanted men in this part of the country. And these are some of his NPA guerrillas. They met us here in the village. They're going to take us up into their camp today. So after 3 hours of quite difficult walking, started to see small tents and structures, very temporary looking.
As we arrived, I was surprised at how young they were. Sol told me how watching his family struggle for money had driven him to take up arms.
Sol is a former university student. He said he comes from a very poor family, and what motivated him to join the MPA in particular was the fact that the government seems to only take care of the very rich few in the Philippines while disregarding and ignoring the vast majority of poor people who live a life of poverty.
Simon lectured the new recruits in how their country's resources are being denied to them.
So Simon's briefing is focusing on their understanding of the fact that 1% of the population controls most of the country's wealth, re-emphasising to people that they've tried politically to change that, but the forces of the military and the police are used against them, and therefore they had to take up weapons.
Simon claimed left-wing leaders are being routinely eliminated by the state security services.
They use the military, they use the courts, and they use the system against our own interests.
Who's they?
The ruling class.
In the face of political suppression, we're told new recruits flock to the camps like these in their hundreds.
We saw you training with the weapon. Would you be prepared to actually shoot somebody with that weapon? Julie says that yes, she's very emphatically prepared to use the weapon to shoot somebody because in the name of or in the support of the people.
Simon showed me video footage of a recent NPA attack on government soldiers. He said the army were protecting a gold mine opposed by local people.
Over the past couple of years, the number of clashes between the NPA guerrillas and the government army has increased dramatically.
The rebels admit killing hundreds of soldiers, officials and informers. As we left the camp, we needed to avoid the military. In their hunt for the NPA, we're told the army have moved in to nearby villages. As we arrived in one village, straight away we see army camouflage and troops camped under people's houses. We wanted to ask the villagers why the army was here.
Hello, sir.
Headman Aguinaldo Ambising agreed to see us, but only behind closed doors.
What's your position here?
He told me the village had protested against a foreign mining firm exploring for gold.
Interestingly enough, once the local communities here managed to stop the mining exploration by the big international firm, that's when the military moved into this village.
He said the army issued a list of groups it believed are fronts for the communist rebels. The village's anti-mining group was on it.
Did they follow that up with any violence or any intimidation?
He said the troops had threatened local leaders.
Aguinaldo's very reluctant to go into too much detail. He says to me that the military's here. I have to be very careful, not just for my community's safety, but also for my own safety. There is only one life.
Aguinaldo told me soldiers were camped right next door. Before we left the village, we wanted to ask them if they were there to protect the mining interests in the area, but they didn't want to speak to us.
Good morning.
If you want to know what is the real situation here, please drop by at Carbarit.
So the guys are not authorised to speak, but they tell us if we want to talk to anybody about the security here, we have to go to the headquarters. It's time for us to leave.
On the way out, we found the list Aguinaldo had told us about.
As you can see behind me here is a list of what the army says are fronts for the Communist Party, and that includes all the organisations that have been acting against the mining campaign here and also working for the peasants. But that's the sort of list they put up as a way to tell people that they are being targeted by the military.
We wanted to know if the lists are warnings or actually leading to deaths. We headed to the capital, Manila, where the military is based and where the division between rich and poor is most visible.
We were just driving through Manila and we saw this huge plume of black smoke.
We found hundreds of people fleeing from a slum on fire.
Can we get up? We've come as close as we can to the fire and people are swimming across the canal trying to save their last possessions. This barrio, this slum, is really just an interconnecting warren of rooms and buildings in very, very poor condition. Why do you think this fire happened?
Michelle told me she thought the fire was no accident, but the result of a long-running dispute with developers who wanted the land.
But the people here have stood their ground because they've got no alternative housing. And this has all been coming to a head until now, today's fire.
Michelle wanted to show me more of the slum. She told me millions of poor people live like this, with little help from the government.
Rich landowner.
Poor people is become poor people, stay still poor. And the rich people become rich. Rich, 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 rich.
We were told that fires and evictions were not the only methods being used in this class war.
Mary?
I'd arranged to meet Guy Portuhada, who told me many people fighting for the rights of the poor were going missing. She helps the families of those who have disappeared.
How many people are disappearing?
Since 2001 of 2000.
Guy told me scores of people are going missing every year, and that all of them had been campaigners for social change.
So Guy's saying that, in fact, over the past 7 years, there have been 193 cases of abductions. So what do you do now?
I try to help the other families.
She told me she'd been driven to help others following the abduction of her own father, a union leader, when she was just 11.
I feel alone and sad. What happened to my father?
We joined Guy as she went to investigate a recent disappearance. We picked up Nanny Chris. She told us her husband, Abner, had been a lifelong activist who had worked with poor farmers. He went missing several months ago.
This is the place where it happened.
Okay. Chris is saying that on March the 22nd last year, her husband was riding a small tricycle like this one. He got to this point and a white van pulled up in front of him. A couple of men came out of the buildings just next to us and grabbed him and shoved him into the van. The men were all wearing white shirts, camouflage pants and combat boots and carrying M16 automatic weapons, and nobody's heard from him since.
Guy told us the description of men in military uniforms is the same in almost every case of abduction that she's investigated.
Just been allowed to come into the hospital. They're going to hopefully check the records to see if his picture has turned up, basically if his body's been brought in.
After months without news, Chris told us she feared for the worst.
He hasn't been admitted to hospital either as a patient or dead.
It seemed as if Abner's entire existence had been virtually erased.
How does it affect you?
Of course, it's very hard for us. But we can't do anything.
Chris is just saying that just 2 weeks ago she moved out the double bed they used to use and moved in a bunk for her daughter and niece, and she now sleeps in a single bed here. I guess it's perhaps part of a gradual acceptance that he might not be coming back.
Guy claims that in addition to the 193 missing without explanation, more than 900 social activists are said to have been assassinated by military death squads.
Okay, so we've come to this village because we've heard of another disappearance, and in this time they've got some evidence about who did it. Hi, Connie.
Good morning.
Hi, I'm Evan.
I'm Mrs. Empeño. I'm the mother of Karen.
Okay.
I'm Connie Empeño, mother of Karen.
Right, and this is your daughter who went missing.
Karen Empeño was a student activist who went missing 2 years ago. We arrive on what would have been her 25th birthday.
Room that we have.
So this is Karen's room?
Her mother, Connie, wanted to show me some of Karen's possessions. They included a scrapbook Karen had made of her life.
I mean, it's a very moving scrapbook, and it shows a girl who's not only done extremely well in school, but also is very creative. And one of the sayings she's got in there is, lots of people chase their dreams, but you caught yours. And then it shows a picture of her graduating from high school. And the tragedy of this is that what's happened means that this is a very promising life that's been stolen. What do you find personally the hardest thing to go through?
I do not know where she is. I do not want to think. Because what I'm hoping is that Karen will be coming home still alive.
Connie told me Karen was studying social reform and had been interviewing farmers for her thesis when she went missing. She showed me sworn statements from 2 witnesses who described how Karen was abducted from the farmhouse where she was staying.
We saw at least 5 armed men wearing fatigues and other in civilian clothes, but were wearing combat shoes. That is why we thought that these men outside our house were from the military.
This is Karen's father, Oscar. He told me he believed Karen had been targeted because she was an active campaigner against government corruption.
Once you are an organizer, once you are an activist, they call you a communist. That means you are an enemy of the state. When you are an enemy of the state, they can abduct you, they can harass you, they can kill you, anything. That's the killing machine of the president, the military.
For 2 years, they've had no news of their missing daughter. We had heard many allegations that soldiers were behind the killings and abductions. but proving they were being conducted with official sanction by army death squads was more difficult.
We've been trying to find somebody from within the military who can verify that they are in fact being used to target left-wing civilians. It's quite difficult, and we've been told to come to this office block in the middle of Manila. We can't say where it is or who we're seeing, but somebody here, we're told, might be able to help us.
For his security, we can't identify the man we met. He told me he was an ex-army corporal and was coming forward now to express his anger at what soldiers are ordered to do.
What he's saying is that there's a special group within the military which is specifically targeting civilians, suspected left-wing people, suspected communists, human rights workers, and they operate within the regiment Camp Texon that he was in. Independently. They have their own password, their own processes, they don't have to answer to anybody else, and they have a safe house inside the military camp where they bring civilian detainees who they interrogate and torture. What are you told as soldiers about the threat from left-wing groups?
He told me soldiers are taught that anybody from the left hates the military and it's a soldier's duty to eliminate them.
It's not just armed NPA combatants, it's anybody from the left wing. Okay, Nico, thank you.
The next day we found troops on the streets. A protest was underway against the killing and abduction of activists and government inaction on poverty. They called on the country's President Gloria Arroyo to take action. We were surprised to see the disappearance of student Karen Empeño reenacted as part of the demonstration.
So that was a recreation of the abduction of Karen, and the guy was saying to the crowd, who among you is Karen? And they all said, I am. The meaning of the message is we can all be abducted.
Protesters complained the military served only to protect the interests of the elite.
This is Teddy Casino, who's one of the leading left-wing parliamentarians. He's a legal party member. What are the main problems here in the Philippines? Why are there so many people in the left seeking change?
We have a political elite. You're talking basically about 135 families. These are the political dynasties. These are the big business conglomerates controlled by families. And they basically hold economic and political power in the Philippines.
Tell me what's happening to your party, Bayan Muna.
Well, our party has borne the brunt of the extrajudicial killings that have been happening at an alarming rate since 2001. More than 130 members have already fell victims to these kinds of assassinations or summary executions. And
130 members?
133 to be exact.
133 members of a legal left-wing party, your party,
yes.
A legal left-wing party,
right.
Have been killed.
Yes.
Among the protesters were relatives of the disappeared. They read out the names of their missing loved ones.
In the morgue, in the military camps, they came, we looked, we still could not find them. Mabuhay ang desaparecidos!
My son was taken in April 28, 2007, here in Evercatesco, this building.
Just here?
Yes, just here. Inside the restaurant, he was having lunch by himself.
As a mother, what are you going through?
I just wish no mother would go through what I am going through. And I wish that the President of the Philippines would not go through this too. Because if she does, she would know how a mother hurts every day.
The real tragedy here for me is the way these people live in complete limbo. Their applications for information are met with complete silence. They get absolutely no information about the treatment or even the whereabouts of their loved ones.
Under the banner of terrorists.
Regardless of the violence, the fight for a more equal share of this country's wealth seems set to continue. The disappearances and killings have done nothing but fuel the left-wing movement they are meant to destroy. We wanted to know to what lengths the military were prepared to go. We arranged a meeting with the Army's Human Rights Division. human rights organisation says that 900 people have been killed in extrajudicial killings and 193 people disappeared over the past 7 or 8 years.
Okay.
They say the military is doing that.
The accusation or the allegation is not true. Well, it is true that we have scalawags, a member of our organization, but our organizations will not condone nor tolerate in punishing these individuals.
Are you saying that there are some cases of soldiers?
There are some cases. In fact, as of this moment, we are closely coordinating with the Department of Justice for the arrest of one of the members who are accused of murder.
When I asked him about missing student Karen Empeño, he told me her case is still being investigated. Even if the military could not provide answers about Karen's whereabouts, our underground contacts, it seems, could. We're being taken across Manila to meet a man who we're told has some very important information about Karen's whereabouts. Our contacts told us because of what he'd witnessed, this man was on the run from the military. XNL 977, okay. We had to change vehicles to make sure we didn't lead the army to him. Our connections have just made sure that the man we meant to meet is coming into the vehicle. We have to be very careful. Hi. Raymond, Evan. Why is the military looking for you? He told me he'd witnessed Karen being detained by the military. He's come here today to this safe house to meet Karen's parents, Connie and her father, to tell them what he knows. This is the first time they had heard from anyone who'd seen Karen since she disappeared. Raymond's now describing how when he was in military custody and the girls were brought into the same camp, they could hear the girls being tortured by the soldiers. He's describing how they were being hit over their body, in their legs and their chest very hard, to the point where he heard them saying that they couldn't stand it any longer. Raymond told them Karen was also raped by soldiers in the camp. Then the words that Connie and Oscar never wanted to hear. Raymond's just told the parents that he is almost certain that Karen is dead because the military told them that him and his brother were the only two left alive, and then he later heard that the remains of the girls had been buried with another man who was killed inside military custody.
I still believe that Karen is still alive. I strongly believe.
How does it feel having this information from Raymond when he tells you how Karen was being tortured?
Feel being distressed by these events, but anyway, as I've told you, that war never heals until such time that I have to see my daughter again.
It seems as long as the military continues to target civilians in this class war, many more parents across the Philippines will be waiting for their children to come home.
To people that they've tried politically to change that, but the forces of the military and the police are used against them, and therefore they had to take up weapons.
Simon claimed left-wing leaders are being routinely eliminated by the state security services.
They use the military, they use the courts, and they use the system against our own interests.
Who's they?
The ruling class.
In the face of political suppression, we're told new recruits flock to the camps like these in their hundreds. We saw you
training with the weapon, would you be prepared to actually shoot somebody with that weapon?
Sol told me how watching his family struggle for money had driven him to take up arms.
Sol is a former university student. He said he comes from a very poor family, and what motivated him to join the MPA in particular was the fact that the government seems to only take care of the very rich few in the Philippines while disregarding and ignoring the vast majority of poor people who live a life of poverty.
Simon lectured the new recruits in how their country's resources are being denied to them.
So Simon's briefing is focusing on their understanding of the fact that 1% of the population controls most of the country's wealth, re-emphasising.
A slum set alight in the Philippine capital, Manila. A war is raging between rich and poor. At stake, control of the country's resources. The battle lines have been drawn and the military are taking sides. Now, hundreds of civilians are being killed and abducted, and the relatives of the missing are crying out for help.
They say there's been 910 extrajudicial killings, there's 225 political prisoners, and there's 193 disappearances.
These were the rebels we'd come to meet, fighters of the New People's Army, deemed terrorists by the Filipino government.
So this is Simon, who's the NPA leader of this area, one of the most notorious and actually one of the government's most wanted men in this part of the country. And these are some of his NPA guerrillas. They met us here in the village. They're going to take us up into their camp today. So after 3 hours of quite difficult walking, started to see small tents and structures, very temporary looking.
As we arrived, I was surprised at how young they were. Our journey begins in the remote northern highlands of the Philippines. We're here to meet Marxist rebels who've waged a 40-year civil war for a communist state.
We've been travelling most of the night along these mountainous roads to get to a town to meet a contact who we're told will take us in to see the armed communist rebels. We're not quite sure what that's going to entail yet, but we're told there will be a trek involved.
The rebels are suspicious of any outside contact, and it's taken weeks of negotiation for us to be allowed in. We're taken along a concealed path to avoid being seen by the government army.
Good morning. How are you?
Suddenly armed men emerge from the jungle.